to talk about chain making, and there's all kinds of beautiful chain that you can order, and you can do some really interesting things with buying pre-made chain. But I like my intermediate students to learn to make chain because it makes you more efficient at the bench so that you're more productive, and it also helps you get to be better at soldering. So when you come up with your design, I'm not going to say that it has to be a 28-inch chain or a 24-inch chain. I'm going to say you have to have at least 12 solder joints in your chain, because that'll give you a little bit more flexibility. But I want to talk about two different kinds of chain. The chain that I had to learn how to do when I was in school was what was called a foxtail, and that's this one here. And I started making parts for it and realized the chain that the wire I was working with was silver plated copper. If you're interested in doing the foxtail, what we have to do is you need to go into the Chain Gang handouts that I put in Canvas, and I can direct you there. And then you need to find the right mandrel size to wrap your chain around with the size wire that you're working with. So I've got 26 gauge wire, wrapping it around, I think it's a 3/16 mandrel. I've made my chains, I've soldered them together, and then I've gone in and I've pulled them apart, and then I've pinched them together like a bow tie, and then I've soldered one of those that's been curled up onto this piece of copper, and now I'm ready to start feeding these through the links, and I'll show you later how I've made a little wooden mandrel that has a hole in it so that you can pull them through. So first you have to figure out your mandrel size, your wire size. You need to solder all your jump rings together. Then you pull them oval. The way that they're pulled oval, the simplest way to do it is with a pair of round nose pliers. And what I do is I put it in the round nose pliers, and then I just pull out. And then to get the bow tie, I come into the center and I pinch it together. And so that's how I've gotten that system down. I was off center there because it's a demo. I'm always off center when it comes to that. That's one way to do it. Another way is that they have these type of pliers that actually, when you squeeze them together, they open up. And this has different sections on here. So I can actually, and we've lost the part that opens it up that way, but I'll put it there, and then I can pull, and then that gives it an oval-ish shape that's there. But like I said, I just use my round nose pliers. Maybe it's a time for me for a moment to talk about pliers. It's really worth buying a good pair of pliers. One of the things you need to know is that there's a lap joint plier. Do I have a lap joint one? I don't. Lap joint, or there's a box joint, and a box joint means that it's got two sides and then a piece that fits in there. That's a much more stable plier to work with than a lap joint that just has two that twists this way. So that's one of the things to think about. This is made in Pakistan, and actually the Pakistanis are wonderful metalsmiths. The other thing you want to think about is size. So I kind of don't like the really small ones. I'm much happier with the medium size, and then this is the large. So I've always had a variety of pliers in the studio so you guys can try them out. And then you can order the set that works best for you. You can spend $10 on a set that are going to be crappy, or you could spend $50 on a set, and somewhere in between on there. And we can talk more about that if you have questions through Zoom. The other thing that you want to think about is a lot of plier work is opening and closing, and you can see how I'm having to use my hand. What's nice about is having a pair of pliers that's spring-loaded. So you see that these, I don't have to do the tension of pushing them back out. And with my older hands, I'm really enjoying these so that I only have that effort of in and out that's there. Okay, so those are the pliers. This is the foxtail. This is the one that I've started doing with heavier gauge. And it's a single foxtail. You can also do a double foxtail where instead of just going through one side, you have them going in 2 axes. And I will talk about that one later. But this being soldered on here is just a way to be able to make the chain come together, and then you would just unsolder this area here. So one of the things you always want to do is you want to use hard solder for all your links when you put things together. You certainly don't want the solder flowing if you're putting your clasp on and then soldering your links together, and that'll happen, and I'll show you how to fix that as well. So this is one way of doing it. And then another way that you can do is chains is just a link and link. And this was my first attempt of making a chain with an oval shape. And instead of pulling it oval with the pliers, what I did is I used to use this low dome brass wire for my handles on my vessels, and I glued 2 of them together with super glue, and then I used this as my mandrel to make my rings that are here on this. So I know a lot of times, and especially in the Chain Gang book, that handout that I have for you guys in Canvas, it talks about taking your wooden dowel and filing it into this shape. I always find if I can do something that's out of metal, that I know when I do the 500th jump ring that this hasn't gotten any smaller by wrapping it around, whereas the wood would do that. So making your own mandrel is an option for you. This is my piece that I did for my locket project a couple quarters ago, and it's cuttlebone. And this is a stone that came from India that I found on the Arabian Sea. And I don't have the little cuttlebone that fits inside here, but I found a little cuttlebone that was about 1 inch long. And I just thought I wanted to mark my time in India and that wonderful experience with Samia and the other women. And so I built this. I've got a little tube on the back to run the chain through. This is supposed to kind of represent India, the Himalaya mountains here. But I've been thinking about the chain that I wanted to do, and I could do something that's a little bit more traditional, and I'm worried about how these conflict with each other design-wise. And so looking for something simpler, I started making this chain. And I feel like it's closer to the size I want for the weight of the pendant, but I still didn't really feel like it had what I wanted. So then just one day when I was looking at it, I thought, well, what's it going to look like if I twist these? And when I started twisting them, they're a little random. This one's perfect, this one's not so perfect, this one's not so perfect. But I started to feel like that they had a rhythm and a pattern, but not perfect, which is kind of what the cuttlebone does. So this is the chain that I want to make for this pendant. And I'm going to solder them together, and then I'm going to twist them after they're all linked together. So one of the things you want to think about when you're doing your chain, all of you guys are going to make about 6 inches out of copper a chain to see if it's what you want and how you're going to use it in your work. Once you've decided that that's what you want to do and it's going to work, then you're going to switch over to working in silver. I really recommend it because the amount of time you put into doing silver. I had a student that made his out of copper. He took it to the plating company, and it cost twice as much to have it silver plated than if he had just made it out of silver. So this is the time to really use silver in your chain making project. So in looking at these projects, when your jump rings are all the same, what you do is you take 50% of your jump rings and you solder them together, and then you link the other ones together. So say this one's soldered. I've got 50% of them soldered. I'm going to flip this through and I'm going to close it. And then I would solder this one after I put the next one on. So you solder 50% of them first, and then you link them together like that. Why my hands are tired is because it's easier to do it without pliers, and I don't leave any marks on it. When I was looking at this project, I was thinking, okay, if I solder these together, when I go to solder this smaller silver jump ring, there's a chance that I could get it soldered to the copper wire. So what I did with this is I soldered all the little silver jump rings together, and then I came back in and I wove them through and I soldered here. I was able to pull everything away, solder it there, so that when I linked it together, things weren't soldered to themselves that were on there. If this doesn't make sense in the video, I will try to clarify it again for you. But that's what I'm going to do here. I've got this much of the chain going, and I've made my jump rings. So what I want to show you is that I have my 2 jump ring mandrels, and these are mandrels that I made out of steel. So when you're familiar with chain making, which you guys will have already experienced, you can make these. I like to put them in a 90-degree angle so that I could clamp them into the vise and it'll hold and not push down. That's here. So I just heated and bent them into a 90-degree angle. One of my students came back from the hardware store with a hook that has threads on it that you screw into the wall. That was a pre-made one, but if you guys want to make your own jump ring mandrels, I can show you how we heat and twist them. Can you see that this one has the heating temperatures on it to bend it? This one I didn't need to because it's thin enough that it would just bend on its own. But I want to show you how to make jump rings, and I'm going to show you the slower way where there's a whole jump ringer that you can buy and do through Rio Grande. But I want you just to show you guys how to do a simple way so that you don't feel like you have to go out and spend $150 on a jump ringer to make chain. So I'm going to put this in the vise, and I'm going to take my silver wire and I'm going to hold on to the top edge, and I'm just going to make a coil. And there are faster ways to do this. One student came in, she had seen a video with doing it with a drill, and that works, but I think just showing the simplest way the first time around is kind of important. You have this extra that needs, I'm going to see if I can try to bend that over. If I were working in gold, I wouldn't want these extra pieces. I'd want a whole nother jump ring. So can you see how I was able to fold that over? If I do the same thing here, and I bend it down, when I cut this, I will get 1 extra jump ring out of it, okay? So I don't have to do that. Another thing is that a lot of my students like to put masking tape on this when they cut it. You can if you want. I just find that I'm going to just be cutting and catching these as they come off. I have to shift this just a little bit to get my saw frame. I've got a number 2 saw frame. You want to use the smallest blade that you can. And what I'm going to do is come over here, and you can see that there's a little slot in the end of this. I'm going to start my sawing right there. What I'm doing is I'm pushing with my thumb towards the camera so that it doesn't slide around while I'm doing it. And I'm going to keep sliding the coil down so that I'm not cutting into the steel. And you'll see some of them in the jewelry lab where the steel's been cut halfway up the link, or halfway up the mandrel. So you want to just keep pulling this down because the steel will dull your saw blade really fast. So this is the old traditional way of making jump rings. There are faster ways. Somebody I recommend if you really want to do a lot more interesting chain making is to take a class from Julia Lowther. She does a lot of chain making, and she's local. But now I've got these, and I can set them there. Okay, and I've got 2 that are just going to now be scrap. So when you get your piece cut, these are offset, and so now what you want to do is you want to fit them together. So I push them past each other, push them together, and then I pull them out and I line that up. And then I'm going to take these and I'm going to set them on my fireboard. Take the time to really make these touch and line up, because 90% of people's problems with soldering chain is that they don't have the two ends touching each other, and the capillary action of soldering will not come through, and you'll be really discouraged that your links aren't being, oh, this one's got nicks in it, recycle. And I'm so bad with my hands. I could take a pair of flat nose pair of pliers and a pair of chain nose. You want to learn to not mark your metal with pliers, so you don't want to squeeze real tight, but this is the way to do it if you don't want to abuse your hands. And so this is one of those processes where I feel like you can just sit and let your mind kind of relax while you're doing the work. I also find that if I grab onto the pliers in a longer width, there's more spread of the pressure, and you don't mark your chain as much. So now I've got those all lined up. I'm going to come over, and I've got a brand new fireboard. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do production chain soldering, and I'm going to take 50% of my links and I'm going to spread them out, and I'm putting all of the joints facing the same direction so that it's a no-brainer for me as I come along in soldering these. And I'm going to lay them out about 1 inch apart, and I could fill this whole fireboard with jump rings to solder. Okay? And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my hard solder, and this is one of the things I want to share with you guys is I have hard solder here. This is where it is when you buy it. This is what I did when I rolled it through the rolling mill. So this is 16 gauge, so it's pretty heavy wire. So I'm going to just use my solder in the thickness that it comes. But when you start working with chain that's thin like this, these pieces, I actually rolled this solder down through the rolling mill so that it's about 30 gauge. And now when I cut my solder chips, they might not be any smaller than they were for this other chain, but there's a lot less solder there, and then I don't get a lump. The other thing I want to tell you is when I'm working with really thin chain or any wire that's like 24 gauge or thinner, I don't use a jeweler's saw. I actually use my flush cutters, and I cut them with pliers, and I'll be showing you with that with the second chain making project, because that little crimp that happens when you cut it with the pliers, if you have more solder than you should have, it just fills that in. Okay, so that's kind of two different choices here. Another thing I need to talk about is fluxes. So this is the paste flux that we work with, and we can certainly use it. I find that when I'm working with finer wire, like the other chain, I like to use what's called self-pickling flux, the Battern self-pickling flux. This only works on silver and gold. So I'm going to go ahead and use my paste flux for this now, because you guys are going to make your samples out of copper and you're going to want to use it. The reason why I like this Battern self-pickling flux is that I can see where my joint is on a tiny little wire, whereas the paste flux kind of hides that. Once again, putting them all facing one direction, I know where that joint is. So when I go to do the smaller chain for you guys, I'm going to be using this paste. That flux. Okay. So I'm going to take my hard solder, and I'm going to cut some pieces into my little ashtray. So if they start to curl a little bit, I like to straighten them out. and then you want to catch them. And I don't really have to cut really small pieces because this is pretty big chain. So you're going to have to calculate the size of your solder chips when you're doing your sample, and then you're going to want to follow on that. Okay. So I'm going to take a little bit of flux. I'm going to coat my solder. I know that there's some people that don't do that with their solder. That's okay. And then I'm going to very sparingly flux my solder joints. If I get too much flux on the fireboard, it starts to just eat into the fireboard and cause problems. And now I'm going to take my all rusted tweezers and I'm going to come in and I'm going to just set my solder on top. Too much solder there, or too much flux there. The other thing you can do is you can, if your flux is really thin and the water's going to boil everywhere, but can you see how the flux is already drying out even in this classroom that isn't heated? You can put your solder chips underneath and set right on top of it your ring. So there are lots of ways to do chain making. This is how I'm going to go about doing it. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn the torches on. And I'm going to think of my jump ring. Thank you. I'm going to think of my jump ring as being a circle, and I'm going to start heating the bottom opposite of the solder joint. Help me to get there.
It's almost there. There we go.
There you go. Thank you, Erin. Couldn't do this without you. So I'm going to start heating the bottom side of my jump ring, kind of like a smiley face, a student said to me. I don't use that term, but smiley face. And then I'll watch the heat travel around up to the joint. And when the flux goes clear on the joint, I'm going to target with my solder, or with my torch. And then watch the solder flow, but I'll pick it up and throw it into the water. And then I'm going to move along on this. Would I stick feed this? Probably not, because I don't want a bunch of solder on these. There's nothing worse than doing chain making where you have to clean off all your excess solder. I'm going to come in here. I'm going to be aware that these are wire and I don't need that hot of a flame. I'm kind of funny about this is that the flame the hottest is here. I can work out here with a big flame and still solder these, but I think this looks pretty good. I'm going to put it in my non-dominant hand. I'm going to heat the back side, and you saw the solder chip jump, and now the flux is gone clear, and I'm going to come right in and it's soldered. I'm going to pick it up and throw it into the water. This is hissing a little bit, which means it's got too much air. Here we go. Heat the back side. Watch the flux turn clear, target the joint, solder it, heat the back side, the heat transfers to the front, target the joint, and am I where the joint is? Oh, goodness sakes. That one gets set aside.
That's that flux hiding it from you.
Yep. So one of the things you need to know, if solder runs to the one side, it means that you didn't have even heating. So what we'll do is when that starts to happen, I'll heat the other side. There we go. And I pulled the solder across. Okay, it's again here. Flux is clear. Flow the solder. You want to flip it over and make sure that the solder flowed all the way through. I could just for the fun of it heat it again. What I'm looking for is not to see a different thickness of the wire that I've just done. And then this one's on the underneath side. That's a little bit harder because you can't see the solder flow. Did you see that one drop down? Mm-hmm. That one wasn't fit very well. Flip it over. Solder it again. Now these are getting pretty red hot because it's hard solder. Can I solve the problem with the one here? I can't because I didn't flux where the joint is. So I'm going to just put this in water and then put it in the pickle, and I'll come back to that one there. So these all come out, and I'm going to put them in the pickle, and then after they come out of the pickle, if I have too much solder on them, like this one's not bad. Sorry. So there was one that seemed like it had too much solder. This one seems like maybe there's too much solder, but I'm going to pickle them all. This is a time when if you have a nylon stocking to put all of these in, or a little tray so it's easier to get them out of the pickle, is a good idea. So I'm going to do some of these littler ones. No, I'm not, because I gotta. I realized I should have done the littler ones and leave the big ones to do it, but I can do it both ways. I'll show you both ways. So the little ones are a lot harder to close up. And I'm going to do the same thing again by making the good fit. And this one's already soldered. That's what happens when you start a project for a demo and then months go by. So in the end, these are going to look the same, the parts of the chain, but I'm going to do them two different ways because I've soldered those other ones. So I'm going to have to link the soldered ones. I'm going to pull them oval, and then I've got to link these to it. If I didn't have to pull it oval, I probably would solder the little ones first and then hook the bigger one in so I don't solder things together. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Am I on track here? So I think I want to show you how I do this with the self-pickling flux, and people always ask me why it's called self-pickling flux. It doesn't really pickle, but it also you can paint it on a piece and it keeps the oxides as much. But what I like to do with the self-pickling flux, and I prefer Batterns over the Griffin or Griffith, but what I like to do is shake it up, put a little in my tray, and when I get ready to solder these, I'm going to dip my jump rings into the flux, and then I'm going to place solder chips on them. I love these tweezers, but my thumbs are too big. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to pick it up, I'm going to dip it in the water or in the flux. I'm going to pick up my solder chip, going to put it on the joint, going to try to get them all in the right direction. It's a big solder chip, we'll see how it goes. If you have trouble getting your solder chip off your piece, it's because there's water, or in this case the flux, on your tweezers. Wipe them clean and that'll help. I intentionally did not drink a lot of coffee today, and I still got shaky hands. And I dropped one of these in here, so I'm gonna grab it. Did you see all the water just come off that? Yep. Okay. So I'm gonna come in and I'm gonna solder these. It's the same thickness wire, so it's gonna conduct heat, but it's quite a bit smaller. My flame's gonna be a little bit smaller. And I'm gonna come in and I'm gonna heat the back side and see how you can see the solder better. And you almost don't see any flux. Okay. And then I do like to pick them up and throw them into water before they stick to the fireboard. Is your camera picking that up good?
Yeah.
These are small enough that I don't really have to do the smiley face as much, because by the time I heat the bottom of the jump ring, it's all pretty much. So if your solder runs to one side, heat the other side, pull it back over, and if they're making contact, it should flow and come into that capillary action that's there. Okay, so there's always that thing about, oh, you should use hard solder for everything. I always love what happens on the fireboards when they're new.
No, it's like the nuclear bomb scars.
Yeah. Ah, not while we have him in the White House.
Right.
Please don't make me think of that. Okay, so I've got these together. I'm gonna now take the jump rings that aren't closed up, and if I solder these together, I won't be able to pull them oval very well. But I'm gonna show you how I would do this. I'm gonna swing two of those on there. Gonna get these fit together. And then I'm gonna take my interlocking tweezers that need repair. And I'm gonna grab onto my interlocking tweezers at the opposite side of the joint. Okay. And then I'm gonna put a little bit of flux. And in this one, I'm putting this flux on it because I don't want to dip the whole thing, because I don't want the hard solder there to reflow and stick to the big jump ring. So I've got to cut a little bit more solder. And I'm going to take a piece of solder and I'm going to stick it right on top. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in at this angle with my torch, not down, and then I'm going to heat back and forth, and I'm going to hope that the solder goes. I'm going to twist this a little bit so that I can get in line. And that's where these Hope torches are really nice. Okay, I'm going to come in and dry it. And did you see that it's hanging on the underneath side? Oops, and it just fell off. So this is when going in with a solder pick, heat it up hot. It's going to pick up, because solder goes wherever it's the hottest, right? So I'm going to come back in and I'm going to reheat. I'm going to set it on there. Get it to flow. So you can try putting it on the way that I did, or you can just do it with a pick. So just out of curiosity, I'm wondering if I can pull these oval. I should have these dry before I put these beautiful pliers on it. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna come in here and I'm gonna pull it apart. And then I'm gonna look and see if it's not the same joint or the same chain. That means maybe I don't have the right size mandrel. Maybe I have the wrong size. There we go. Can you see where I've come in? Because these are the pliers I used the last time. I'm gonna check and see. It's still not the same length. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead with it because I've got them made for the demo. And what am I gonna do now? I'm gonna come back in, gonna open up one of these, gonna fit it in this way. This is a little bit more challenging because you could solder those little jump rings onto this. Whereas I think the ones I did before, I think what I did is I soldered the big jump rings and then pulled them oval and yeah, it's been too long. So I will do pick soldering. So I'm going to drop my little solder there. The solder likes to go wherever it's the hottest. So what I'm going to do is heat my pickup. These poor old torches. Okay, so I'm going to come in. Going to heat the pickup. You can get it too hot that this solder will solder to the pick. And now I'm going to come in and I'm going to heat across the top. Flux goes clear. I'm going to drop it down on there. And it's soldered. There you go. No, don't tell me. Oh, good. So now I've got it on its way, and I'm just gonna see what happens as I pull these out. When I twist them, I'm wondering if I can get away with them being different. So, Julia Lowther, she's great at doing things where she's so accurate with her chain making, but she's also a mathematician and tutors high school kids, so she's got that kind of brain. I'm gonna pull that out. And now I've got those. And if they still don't come out, I think I need a bigger jump ring, don't I?
I think so.
Seems like it because these are the same width. So here's a really good thing to do when you start making a chain, your sample with your little 6 inches of copper, write down the mandrel size, the chain, everything that you do so that you don't end up doing what I just did, which means I'm going to have to try using a different mandrel and get close to that. Does that pretty much help with that?
Yeah.
Okay.
That was good.
Yeah.
Cool.
So we're back here with the foxtail, and I showed you how to solder jump rings together. I've shown you how to pull them that way, pinch them together. And now you can just by hand feed them through this and pull them yourself. But I found it's much easier if you drill a hole into a scrap piece of wood that's the diameter, right diameter, and I calculated that by the diameter of this one. I got it folded up. And so now when I get it put in there and I get it right in line in the middle, I can just pull down and it pops it up and puts it right in place. I can take the next one, and this is something you could probably do sitting at your TV at home. Not that any of us want to be watching TV at this point, but once again, it's just a nice way instead of trying to do it by hand. Can you see that where it fits in? And now I'm going to just make sure it's on center and pull it through. And now at this point I've begun to make this chain. It was interesting in the Chain Gang handout, they said that I should use this bigger mandrel because it would be harder to fit these all together. So this is a much looser woven one. This is a much tighter one. And they have different looks to them. I don't know if one's better than the other. But this was a really nice, quick way. I just clamped it to my workbench and I just started feeding and pulling and feeding and pulling. And then all of a sudden I had this length to the mandrel for you guys. Okay, so we have scrap wood. I can drill a hole for you if this is the project you want to work with, and go from there.